This is Vesuvius, until recently its shady vineyards resplendent in greenery. The amphorae, full of a celebrated wine. Here are the places which Baccho loved more than the Colli di Nisa. Upon this mountain the satyrs danced yesterday the merry-go-round. Venus' city was here, dearer to her than Sparta. Here was the city that held the glory of Hercules in its name. Now all lies covered by fire and the sad tombstones. The gods themselves would not have wanted to do so much. Solitary, nestled in the middle of a large and fertile plain, tranquil, apparently inert, Vesuvius is for Neapolitans a discreet, familiar, somewhat friendly presence. But this majestic cone of rock, this perfect scenery for a postcard, which, because of its symmetric profile, has made pictures of Naples, Capri, Ischia and Sorrento famous throughout the world, is not just what it seems at first sight. A montagna bella, as the Neapolitans call it. Vesuvius is a volcano, a living mountain. Even though it has been dormant for the last 50 years, it is certainly one of the most frightening volcanoes on Earth, the most dangerous in Europe. Over the last 2,000 years, from Roman times to today, Vesuvius has erupted 50 times, and some of those eruptions have had disastrous consequences. The danger today is that a chaotic urban sprawl has spread right up to the brim of its crater, and the Vesuvius region, with more than 2 million inhabitants, is the most densely populated volcanic area, not only in Europe, but in the whole of the Western world. After the last eruption in 1944, which wiped out the settlement of San Sebastiano, the volcano has become a destination for tourists. Walks along the brim of the crater have become very popular for adventurous day trippers, attracted by the restless charm of the volcano. Recently, the Italian Parliament has turned the Vesuvius and neighboring Monte Somma areas into protected national park territory. Vesuvius is famous the world over for the terrifying eruption in 79 AD, which, along with numerous earthquakes, resulted in the destruction and complete burial of the then densely populated and flourishing towns of Pompeii, Herculaneum, and Stabia. The date was the 24th of August. The time was 10 o'clock in the morning. Once again, the earth suddenly shook. It was a strong tremor, with Vesuvius as its epicenter. The earthquake was just a warning signal. A few minutes later, with an almighty explosion, the volcano blasted off the plug which had been blocking the crater, and its fragments reached an altitude of more than 20,000 meters. This is how one of the most violent natural catastrophes in the history of mankind started. Everything that had been situated at the feet of the volcano was completely buried, and all form of life extinguished within a few hours. Plinius, a Latin writer who lived about 30 kilometers northwest of Vesuvius at Capo Miseno, left this dramatic testimony. For many days preceding the eruption, there had been earth tremors, but nobody took much notice of them because earthquakes are frequent in the Campania region. But that night, the tremors increased so much that it seemed that every house was moving and even collapsing. Dawn had already passed, yet the daylight was still uncertain and faint. The buildings were ruined, and although we were in an open but narrow area, the fear of a building collapsing was great and imminent. We noticed many strange and frightening phenomena here. It seemed as though the sea had folded back onto itself, almost forced back by the shaking of the earth. The beach had certainly widened, and many marine creatures lay stranded on the dry sands. On the opposing side was a terrible black cloud, gashed here and there with snakes of fire turning into a vast glow, similar to bolts of lightning, but much more extensive. The cloud soon lowered over Capri, obscuring the island and the Miseno promontory from view. Ash had already started to fall, but it wasn't dense yet. I turned around. A dense fog was above us and engulfed us in the same way that a torrent spews onto a field. We had just sat down when nighttime came. Not as when there is no moon or when the sky is cloudy, but as when you are in a closed room with no light. You could hear the women groaning, the children screaming, the men shouting. Some were calling for their parents, others for their children, others for their partners, and they recognized them by their voices. Some were crying for help, and some were crying to help their dear ones. Some people, for fear of dying, were begging for death. Many raised their arms to the gods, but most people shouted that the gods no longer existed and that this was the last night of the world. A faint brightening reappeared, but it seemed more like the nearing of the fire rather than the light of day. Then the advance of the fire halted, and once again darkness reigned, and thick and heavy ash continued to fall. Every now and then we got up to brush it off, otherwise it would have covered us and crushed us under its weight. Eventually, the fog lessened and disappeared into a type of smoke. Finally, daylight returned, and even the sun reappeared, weakly, as when there is an eclipse. Our anxious faces gazed upon a changed scenery, covered in a thick layer of ash, as if it had snowed. Today, almost 2,000 years later, thanks to extraordinary and precious archaeological findings, historians have been able to reconstruct the phases of that tragedy.
Here we have clear indications as to the great quantity of material emitted by the volcano during the eruption of 79 AD, before reaching the drama and tragedy of the citizens of Pompeii. From the lower part up to the height of the bodies, we have at least 3 meters of pumice, as we can see at this point. In the lower part, we find the otrio or other material transported by the roofs, which collapsed during the eruption, which created the pumice. At this height, we actually have the separation of the pumice from the ash, which caused great destruction because they were traveling at high speed, around 100 kilometers per hour. Here we are among the bodies of the citizens of Pompeii who've been swept away by the eruptions. These new findings help us to better understand the mechanism of the eruption of 79 AD. For a start, these bodies are in the top part of the deposit, in other words, in the products emitted by the eruption. They are practically on the roofs of the houses of Pompeii.
A questo punto qui possiamo dire questo, che durante la prima fase dell'eruzione
At this point, we can say that during the first phase of the eruption, when the pumice stone fell over Pompeii and caused the roofs to collapse, these people were still alive. They were overwhelmed during the second part of the eruption. We can see that the bodies are distributed very chaotically, and together with the bodies, we've also found some building material.
Questa seconda fase, quando I pompeani forse allontanatisi prima e poi ritornati.
During this second phase, when the citizens of Pompeii who had maybe left were returning, a second explosion occurred, which was much stronger than the first. This time an avalanche of material came down from Vesuvius. Ash, gas, and, as we can see by the entangled bodies, construction material, tiles, and other things. And these bodies were in fact found in a bank of ash around 50 to 60 centimeters above the pumice.
But the 79 AD eruption is just the most famous of the Vesuvius eruptions. The history of volcanoes is as long as the history of planet Earth itself. Despite the enormous difficulties in comprehending what happened in long-gone times, historians have managed to reconstruct in broad terms the history of Vesuvius over the last 20,000 years. In order to make civil protection plans, it is necessary to create a long-term program for the timely evacuation of the population at risk. Scientific activities which can guarantee correct forecasts on any possible eruptions in the short term are therefore of fundamental importance. How are these forecasts possible? Fortunately, as we have seen, volcanic activity is not sudden and is predictable in the short term by way of various warning signs. Small earth tremors, slow swellings of the volcano, changes in temperature, and from the gases at the mouths of the craters. At the Osservatorio Vesuviano, a prestigious institute which has been studying the volcano for 150 years, a supervision center has been set up, which is in service 24 hours a day. Thanks to its sensor networks, it analyzes the highly accurate data that it has surveyed. The data enables the center to understand what is happening at great depths, and so to forecast what is going to happen in the near future. For the next few years, the forecasts are quite reassuring.